Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The sky was a heavy gray, as if the world itself shared the weight of loss. A light rain fell on Greenwood Cemetery, making the paths slippery and the headstones shiny with sadness. The guests moved slowly, umbrellas flapping in the mist like small sentinels, powerless against the pain. At the center of the ceremony, a dark wooden coffin waited to be lowered into the earth. White flowers, carefully arranged by trembling hands, adorned it, and the air carried a mixture of rose and damp earth. Everyone knew Margaret Harrison, the family matriarch, a woman of strong character but a generous heart. Her passing left a huge void, and everyone felt this absence like a weight on their shoulders. Beside the coffin, in a cradle elaborately decorated with ribbons and flowers, slept Margaret's 9-month-old baby, Emma. Her soft breathing contrasted with the heavy silence of the congregation. No one could have imagined that such a tiny being could one day become the center of attention. The priest, an elderly man with a trembling voice, began reciting the prayers. The words seemed to float in the humid air, almost unreal. The family members bowed their heads, clasping hands, some clenched in grief, others trembling with emotion. Their faces were closed, their hearts heavy. Then, suddenly, an unexpected movement broke the solemn calm. Emma, who had been sleeping peacefully until then, raised one arm, then the other, pointing directly at the coffin. Her eyes, large and black, seemed to shine with a strange light. The adults exchanged confused glances. A shudder ran through the crowd. Some laughed nervously, thinking the baby had simply moved, but others froze, gasping for breath. There was something about his gesture, something deeply disturbing. As if, within that innocent gesture, lay a message no one else could understand. It was then that the baby emitted a piercing cry, clear and high-pitched, which echoed between the tombstones and made the hearts of every guest tremble. The priest interrupted his prayer, surprised, while murmurs began to run among the relatives. Emma's gesture, this simple pointing, had just transformed a mourning ceremony into an event charged with mystery and panic. And so, on that day, in the midst of mourning and silence, a baby became the involuntary witness to a family secret that no one would ever have imagined. The heavy silence of the cemetery was barely broken by the patter of rain on umbrellas when Emma began to move again in her crib. This time, her gesture was clearer. She pointed firmly toward the coffin, then raised both arms in the air, as if calling someone or signaling something important. The guests exchanged worried glances. Some smiled nervously, trying to defuse the situation. "Babies do that all the time," a cousin whispered, trying to reassure the others. But this gesture was anything but normal. Emma's eyes shone with a disturbing intensity, and her voice, a small, high-pitched, shrill cry, cut through the murmur of the guests. Thomas Harrison's, the grandfather's, heart sank. He felt that this was not just a baby's whim. The priest, visibly uncomfortable, stopped mid-prayer and frowned. The tension in the air became palpable. Some guests began to back away in discomfort. "But, what is she doing?" a woman asked, trembling. "Why is she pointing?" stammered another. Emma wasn't crying yet, but her piercing cries resonated with an almost supernatural clarity. Thomas's hands trembled as he approached the crib to calm his granddaughter. But no sooner had he placed his hand on her than she leaned slightly toward the coffin, as if to indicate it more insistently. At that moment, something changed. A cold shudder ran through the assembly. The adults instinctively felt that this innocent gesture carried a message, a secret that Margaret had carried with her and that Emma, inexplicably, seemed to want to reveal. A dull panic began to spread. Murmurs turned into whispered questions. "What does she see? Is it possible? She knows something." And so, amidst the mourning and the rain, a simple gesture from a baby began to sow confusion and fear, transforming a solemn ceremony into a scene of suspense and mystery. The sky continued to weep over the cemetery, but now everyone's attention was entirely focused on Emma. Each of the baby's high-pitched cries echoed through the damp, heavy air, and the guests felt increasingly uneasy. Some of them stepped back, their faces ashen, as if Emma's gesture had awakened a fear they could not explain. Cousin Lydia whispered in a low voice. "She's not just a baby, she's showing us something." Thomas Harrison, the grandfather, felt a chill run down his spine. His instincts told him the baby was pointing at something specific, and that something was no ordinary one. He approached the crib cautiously, but no sooner had he placed his hand on Emma than she leaned closer, her small fingers pointing toward a specific corner of the coffin. Emma's scream, more piercing and prolonged, rang out again, breaking the solemn silence. The guests exchanged panicked glances. The murmurs turned into frightened whispers. "Maybe she saw something." "What then?" "I don't know, but it's terrifying." The priest, trying to keep calm, tried to resume the ceremony. "My dear friends, let us stay." But his voice was trembling, unable to cover the mounting tension. Then Emma made an even more unusual gesture. She straightened slightly, pointed firmly at the coffin, and made a movement toward the ground, as if to indicate something hidden or forgotten. An icy silence fell over the assembly. The baby had just triggered a silent panic, a mixture of curiosity and fear. Every guest felt that this seemingly innocent gesture actually carried the weight of a long-buried secret. Thomas, his heart pounding, looked down at the spot the baby was pointing at, and saw a small, strange detail, a piece of fabric sticking out of the floor, barely visible. His hands trembled as he bent down to pick it up, aware that this gesture might reveal something terrible or unexpected. The rain was still falling, but now each drop seemed to hammer home the suspense, and the morning ceremony had transformed into a scene of mystery and anguish, where the baby seemed to hold in its hands a role that no one had ever anticipated. Thomas Harrison felt his heart beat faster than ever. The baby continued to stare at him, her deep black eyes shining with an eerie intensity, as if she were guiding him. He looked down at the floor, where Emma had pointed insistently. Beneath the coffin, half covered with dirt and wet leaves, a small bundle was visible. Thomas grasped it carefully. His hands trembled as he brushed off the rain and dirt that had covered it. The bundle looked ancient, fragile, wrapped in a yellowed, weather-worn cloth. The guests watched, mouths agape. The murmur grew louder, some instinctively backing away. "What is this?" "It's impossible. Margaret would have hidden something." "Emma, that baby, she found it." Thomas slowly opened the package. Inside was a yellowed letter sealed with an old ribbon and a finely crafted gold locket. Thomas's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. The air suddenly seemed heavier, charged with a tension no one had anticipated. He carefully unfolded the letter. Margaret Harrison's words appeared in handwriting, shaky but firm. It revealed a long-kept secret, an ancient family conflict, a forgotten legacy, and a betrayal that had scarred the family decades before. The baby let out another cry, almost as if to emphasize the importance of the moment. The guests moved closer in spite of themselves, unable to look away. The murmurs turned into hurried whispers. "That's true. Margaret knew. She lied to us. This necklace, it must belong to someone here." Thomas clutched the locket in his hand, realizing the magnitude of the revelation. Little Emma, with her innocent gesture, had just uncovered a secret that even adults had never suspected. This day of mourning had just turned into a veritable emotional storm, where hidden truths threatened to turn everything upside down. The rain continued to fall, but now it served not only as a backdrop to the mourning, it seemed to accentuate the drama, as if nature itself were accompanying Margaret's revelations. The once silent cemetery was now filled with hurried whispers and suspicious glances. Margaret's letter and the locket had changed the atmosphere in an instant. Everyone seemed to suddenly discover that the family had been hiding secrets for decades. Thomas Harrison, still in shock, read the letter aloud. The words revealed an ancient betrayal. A family member had embezzled part of Margaret's inheritance, and the locket was the key to solving the mystery. The letter was hardly finished when Emma's cousin Lydia cried out. "You did it." She pointed at her brother, Daniel, who immediately paled. "That's not true," he stammered, but his voice was trembling, unable to convince anyone. Further whispers turned into open accusations. The guests quickly divided between those who wanted to protect family secrets and those who demanded the truth. Long-buried grudges burst like lightning in the gray sky. Emma, still in her crib, watched the scene with a strange tranquility. Her small gestures, previously considered innocent, now seemed to orchestrate the revelations. Every movement of the baby reminded the family that the secret had been exposed and there was no turning back. Thomas tried to calm the situation. "Stop. This is not the time to fight." But no one was really listening to him. The looks were hard, some filled with anger, others with fear. The locket in his hand seemed to burn with truth, and the mere act of showing it made the tension rise. A heavy silence fell as the baby raised his hand again, this time pointing at Daniel. A shudder ran through the crowd. Little Emma, unknowingly, had just pointed out the culprit, and the murmurs turned into shouts. "It's him! It's Daniel! Margaret warned us!" The ceremony, which was supposed to be a moment of mourning and contemplation, had turned into a scene of intense confrontation, where a baby had become the catalyst for revelations and accusations. Even in the rain, every guest's face reflected panic and confusion. The Harrison family had just discovered that grief could also be the beginning of a storm of truth. As accusations flew and rain hammered the cemetery, Emma let out another cry, higher-pitched and more persistent than the previous ones. The guests immediately turned to the baby. Her tiny fingers curled and this time pointed toward the ground, right next to the coffin. Thomas, the grandfather, felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. He knelt down to examine the spot Emma had indicated. Beneath a thin layer of damp earth, something glowed faintly. He reached out and discovered an old metal box, engraved with delicate patterns and secured with a small, rusty padlock. The murmurs turned into frantic whispers. "What is this? Margaret really hid everything. This baby, she's guiding us." Thomas cautiously opened the box. Inside were several objects, a yellowed notebook, a second silver locket, and a small box containing official documents. Each object seemed to tell a part of Margaret's story and the family betrayal. The notebook contained names, dates, and accounts detailing a long-forgotten inheritance dispute. The second locket, engraved with Daniel's initials, revealed that the cousin had been directly involved in the betrayal, confirming the accusations made earlier. Emma, still calm but insistent in her gestures, then raised her arms to the sky and emitted a long cry, as if celebrating the discovery or emphasizing its importance. The guests, now shocked and fascinated, understood that the baby had played a key role in this revelation. The accusations escalated. Daniel, unable to deny the evidence, looked down, while the other family members expressed their anger and disappointment. The storm of revelations was only just beginning. Thomas turned to Emma, his heart pounding, and whispered, "You found the truth, little one, and now you have to face what Margaret left behind." The innocent yet pivotal baby had just set in motion a chain of events that would forever transform the Harrison family. The mourning ceremony was no longer a moment of passive sadness, it had become the scene of a secret revealed, a betrayal exposed, and a mystery that was only just beginning. The sky continued to rain over the cemetery, but the rain only served to emphasize the growing chaos among the guests. The revelations provoked by Emma's gesture had transformed the ceremony into a veritable field of tension. Daniel, the accused cousin, tried to defend himself, his voice trembling. "It's not what you think. Margaret, she..." But his words were lost in the tumult of murmurs and exclamations from the other members of the family. The silver locket and the notebook left no room for doubt. Some of the guests began to back away, some even wanting to leave the cemetery, overcome by irrational fear. The rain made the paths slippery, and the atmosphere, laden with secrets, made every movement more difficult. Emma, in her crib, raised her arms again and squealed. This time, she pointed at her cousin, Lydia, who paled as she realized that the baby seemed to implicate several people in this story of betrayal. The guests' gazes fixed on Lydia, a mixture of fear and suspicion. "What does she mean by that?" whispered a neighbor, worried. "Everyone seems to be involved," added another, trembling in the rain. Thomas felt a lump of panic rise in his throat. The baby, with its innocence, had set off a chain of events he couldn't control. The truth had just come to light, but with it, fear, anger, and incomprehension were spreading like a tide. The priest, who had been impassive until then, shook his head and murmured, "This baby. I've never seen anything like it." The guests, caught between grief and panic, scattered slightly, some seeking shelter under trees or behind graves. But Emma continued to stare at them, her eyes reflecting a maturity strange beyond her years. Her innocent actions had awakened the family's buried demons, and it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas, holding the locket and notebook, understood that the real challenge began now, managing the revealed secrets and the explosive reactions of those close to him. The baby, unaware of his role, had unleashed a storm of fear and truth that would only grow. The cemetery had become a scene of tension and confusion. The rain continued to fall, but no one really noticed it anymore. The guests were frozen between fear, anger, and curiosity, unable to look away from the child whose actions would now orchestrate the revelations. Emma sat up in her crib and pointed this time at an old wooden box hidden behind the coffin. Her high-pitched, insistent cries immediately attracted attention. "Look!" Thomas exclaimed, his heart pounding. "The baby, she wants us to see it." Daniel, pale as a sheet, instinctively stepped back. He understood that every move the baby made pointed him further and that Margaret's secrets would continue to be revealed. The other guests, trembling, approached hesitantly. Thomas cautiously opened the box. Inside, he discovered an old official document, sealed with a wax seal. This document revealed that parts of the inheritance had been embezzled and that the true beneficiary was not the one the family believed. Shock ran through the assembly. Lydia, unable to contain her emotion, screamed. "That's not true. Margaret couldn't have." But Emma, still pointing and shouting, seemed to insist, the truth had to be seen and heard by everyone. Panic rose when some guests realized the document listed specific names they knew, family members present that day. Murmurs turned to cries of disbelief. "It's him. She lied to us. Margaret knew everything." Emma, in her innocence, continued to play a central role. Every gesture seemed to guide the adults toward what Margaret had hidden during her lifetime. The morning ceremony, which was supposed to be a moment of contemplation, had become a scene of chaos, revelations, and confrontation. Thomas looked at the baby, both impressed and terrified. He realized that this child, with her simple but precise gestures, had just revealed truths that the Harrison family would have liked to bury forever. The rain was falling on them, but now the real storm was that of emotions and secrets revealed. The pouring rain seemed to amplify the chaos. Guests crowded around Emma's coffin and crib, each reacting differently to the mounting revelations. Some wanted to flee, others to confront the problem head-on. But the baby's gesture continued to keep them alert, like an invisible guide to the truth. Daniel, the accused cousin, cried out in despair. "I'm not guilty. You have to believe me." But his words were lost in the tumult. The revealed documents and medallions left no room for doubt. Some of the guests began to back away, slipping on the soggy ground. Their eyes were filled with fear and confusion. Lydia, trembling, also backed away, as if Emma had pointed at her without her understanding why. Thomas leaned down to the baby, speaking softly to him. "Emma, what are you trying to show us again?" The baby responded with a high-pitched cry and this time pointed to a corner of the cemetery, where a tombstone seemed slightly out of place. Intrigued, Thomas approached and moved the stone. Beneath it lay an antique wooden box, reinforcing the impression that Margaret had prepared a chain of revelations. The guests held their breath, aware that each discovery increased the tension and anger within the family. The baby, with his innocence and precise gestures, had brought to light not only Daniel's betrayal, but also secrets that some thought buried forever. Fear and panic were evident on the faces of the guests, some wanted to flee, others seemed unable to move, frozen by the magnitude of the revelations. The priest, helpless, murmured, "I have never witnessed anything like this, a baby, revealing secrets we never imagined." The cemetery was no longer simply a place of mourning, it had become the scene of an intense family confrontation, where every gesture of the baby seemed to push the adults towards the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Greenwood Cemetery was unrecognizable. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with tension and revelation. The guests, soaked and exhausted from the shock of the discoveries, stood around Emma's coffin and crib, each understanding that this was anything but normal. Thomas Harrison, holding the documents and medallions, turned to his family members. "It's time to face the truth. We can no longer ignore what Margaret has revealed." Daniel, the accused cousin, bowed his head, unable to deny the evidence. The letter, the notebook, and the locket had laid bare his past betrayal. The other guests, furious but relieved to finally know the truth, surrounded him, some shouting, others in tears. Emma, sitting in her crib, raised her arms again and cried out. This time, the gesture seemed to approve of the confrontation, as if the baby understood that the truth must be exposed for peace to return. Lydia, her cousin, stepped forward and took a deep breath. "We all made mistakes, but Margaret wanted us to know the truth before it was too late." The words echoed in the silence, and gradually the shouting and accusations began to subside. The family members realized that the confrontation, though painful, was necessary. Thomas placed the lockets and documents on the coffin, symbolizing the end of secrets and the beginning of a new chapter for the Harrison family. Emma, with her uncanny innocence, watched them as if understanding that her role had helped reveal the truth and bring about reconciliation. The tired but more serene faces began to relax. Some hugged each other, others simply stared at the baby, fascinated by the power such a small being had over the family. The ceremony, initially somber and filled with grief, was transformed by an innocent gesture and a baby with an intense gaze into a moment of revelation and truth, marking the beginning of a new era for the Harrisons. The sky over Greenwood had finally cleared. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and flowers. The cemetery, which just hours earlier had been buzzing with tension and chaos, was now calm, almost solemn. Thomas Harrison leaned over Emma's crib. The baby, surprisingly calm, watched the family with her large, dark eyes, as if knowing her mission was accomplished. Her gestures, cries, and points had revealed secrets even adults would never have dared to face. Lydia, taking a deep breath, addressed everyone. "Margaret wanted us to know the truth, so that we could finally mend what had been broken." The family members exchanged glances. Some shed tears, others smiled weakly, but all seemed to understand that the baby's role had been more than just a fluke. Emma had been the catalyst for reconciliation. Thomas placed the locket and letter on the coffin, symbolically sealing Margaret's legacy. These objects were more than just material possessions, they represented truth, justice, and the memory of the woman who had watched over her family until the end. Daniel, now appeased and ashamed, approached Thomas. I'm sorry. I understand now what Margaret wanted, and what we need to do." Thomas nodded, accepting her apology, as the family began to gather around Emma, as if to celebrate not only the end of mourning, but also a new beginning. Emma smiled weakly, unaware of the impact she had had. Her unexpected gesture, in the midst of the funeral, had caused panic, revealed secrets, and ultimately allowed the Harrison family to find peace and restore broken bonds. As the sun slowly broke through the clouds, Thomas whispered, "Margaret would have been proud of you, little girl. Thanks to you, we finally figured it all out." The baby, innocent and peaceful, seemed to approve. The family, gathered around the cradle, knew that, despite the pain and the revelations, a more honest and united future was beginning that day, under the watchful and mysteriously enlightened gaze of little Emma.